The entry of the United States and the Soviet Union into World War II completely turns the tide of the war. The Soviet Union brought in tons of people as well as resources. The United States provided troops, but really the most important contribution from the United States ends up being our industrial abilities. And so with the US and Soviets now in the war, it also is going to force Germany to fight a two-front war, something they had tried to avoid for the duration of the war, because that was one of the reasons for their loss in World War I. And so Allied victories would begin to come starting in 1943. In Russia, the Soviet Union is going to hold their ground at the Battle of Stalingrad. This is a big turning point in the war on the Eastern Front. And they hold their ground and then gradually begin to drive them back out of the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, in Europe, for years, Joseph Stalin had begged Britain and the United States to open up a second front against Germany. However, Britain kept delaying. They didn't feel they were ready. And so at first, instead of attacking through France and opening up that second front, the US and Britain began by invading North Africa. And they're able to kind of turn the tide on Rommel and the Germans in North Africa and gradually take back North Africa and then cross over into Italy and gradually push into Italy and actually force Italy to surrender. And Mussolini is actually going to be shot and killed by an angry mob of civilians, and they take his body and string it up and hang him upside down from a lamppost. And Germany comes in and kind of takes over northern Italy. And so the fighting will continue in Italy, but ultimately Italy surrenders and are brought out of the war. So finally in June of 1944, the British and US will open up that second front that Stalin had been begging for. And the D-Day invasion, they will land on the beaches of Normandy and gain a foothold there and then use that to gradually force the Germans out of France. And so with D-Day, now Germany was forced to fight on two fronts. They were fighting the Soviet Union in the east and the British and US and what was left of the French army on the Western Front. And both sides began to push Germany inward. And once they had kind of gained their foothold in France, the Allies are going to launch round-the-clock strategic bombings on Germany. Germany tries one last big offensive known as the Battle of the Bulge, where briefly they do kind of push a bulge in that Western front line, but reinforcements quickly arrive from the United States and bolster that front line. And finally, they push Germany back. And the US and British and the Soviet Union will meet just south of Berlin, and the Soviet Union will go in and take control of Berlin. Germany is forced to surrender unconditionally on May 8th of 1945, and Hitler, rather than get captured, will commit suicide in an underground bunker. So shifting back to the Pacific now, the Battle of Midway is the big turning point in the war in the Pacific. This is where the United States finally rebuilds and gains the upper hand on Japan after Pearl Harbor. And they're able to break the Japanese code, and they find the location of the Japanese fleet and destroy 4 of Japan's big carriers that day. And this really turns the tide of the entire war in the Pacific. And from this point on, the US is going to use this island hopping strategy. This was overseen by Chester Nimitz and Douglas MacArthur. And what they did is they just went island to island in the Pacific, taking it back from the Japanese. And they would take over the less fortified islands first and use that as staging grounds to take over the more heavily fortified islands. And their goal was to keep pushing closer and closer to Japan so that first they could launch airstrikes on Japan, and B, at this point, they were still thinking they were going to have to launch a land invasion against Japan. And so some of the fiercest fighting in all of World War II is going to take place on the islands of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. These were 2 important spots for staging this land invasion on Japan, and also for launching continuous air raids against Japan as well. And so after some very fierce fighting on these two islands, ultimately the United States gains control of those two islands. And Iwo Jima, for example, was important because we needed it as a place where we could refuel bombers launching bomber raids on Japan. And so once we had those islands, we began these firebombing raids against Japanese cities, including Tokyo, where firebombing raids destroyed like 25% of the city, killed over 100,000 in those fire bombings. Meanwhile, the United States would also, under the Manhattan Project, develop atomic weapons. And the United States decides to use the atomic weapons in order to save lives and bring a faster end to the war. The thought at this point, before the atomic bombs, was that we were going to have to launch a land invasion against Japan. And estimates were that it could cost upwards of 1 million lives to do so. And so Truman decides to use the atomic bombs to try to save American lives and bring a quicker end to the war. And so they dropped the first bomb on Hiroshima, killing around 80,000 instantly. Over time, another 70,000 or so. They give Japan several days to surrender. When they don't hear back from Japan, they drop a second bomb on Nagasaki, killing another 70,000 or so instantly. And after Nagasaki, the Japanese emperor would surrender unconditionally on August 15th, bringing an end to World War II.